press conference this morning. My name is Yan Yip, CEO of Civic Exchange, and sitting next to me is the Director of Hong Kong Transition Project of Hong Kong Baptist University. We are co-launching a report on small house policy, a public opinion survey. 咁我真係好簡單啦，咁我係思匯直情研究所嘅行政總監原因啦。咁坐喺我隔離嘅咧就係香港過渡期研究計劃嘅主任大高禮教授。咁我哋咧就合作咧一齊咧就進行咗一個民意調查嘅。咁就今天咧就呢個記者會咧就發布有關嘅調查。咁喺思匯政策研究所嘅角度嚟去講嘅話咧，或者一啲背景嘅資料啦，咁就係我哋由2003年開始咧，咁其實就已經開始研究小型屋宇政策㗎啦。咁喺2013年嘅4月嘅時候咧，亦都出版過第2個關於呢一個小型屋宇政策嘅報告。咁今年2015年呢一個咧，其實係第3個關於小型屋宇政策嘅報告嘅。咁a little bit background information regarding Civic Exchange work on the small house policy. And we started looking at this policy back in 2003. We published the first ever report on this. And then 10 years after that, and then in 2013, we published another one. And then so for this year, we're publishing the third in a series on this small house policy. And this is a public opinion survey. And then without further ado, I'm going to hand over the time to Michael to explain the survey and also to tell us the key findings of this public opinion survey. Very groundbreaking. Over to you.
Do we need to do translation on this?
No.
All right. This is as Yan was saying, the first two researches that were done by Civic Exchange gave us some background materials, and as all this research also indicated that there were holes in the data and the knowledge. Okay, that we need. I mean, for example, just how many people have the right to ask the government to grant them land for a 700 square foot house of no more than 3 stories? Anybody know that number off the top? Surprisingly, if you go researching that and trying to find it, whoever knows it has not told anybody else. Okay, and of course there are claims. I mean, the Hung Ye Cook will either give you a small number or a large number, depending on what it is they want. Okay, so this was an attempt to try to fill a number of holes about just exactly what's going on here, how many people are in what. We do know, well, you know how big the New Territories is, right? In comparison to the rest of Hong Kong, that's the biggest part of Hong Kong. Now, one of the biggest problems in Hong Kong, of course, is land. Land use, land policy, housing, land. Okay, now, what, 90% of Hong Kong is in the New Territories, and it has these claims on it. Okay, because the New Territories were leased, and supposedly the small house policy, if you look back, okay, anybody know when this actually started? When they actually started getting this right? Now they claim it's Qing dynasty, okay, hundreds of years old, okay, but it didn't start in Hong Kong. No, not the 1770s, not the 1870s. It was the 1970s. Okay. So this is a very ancient right with a very modern origin, okay, in that sense. And that's what the first 2 reports get digging into. Okay, where did this come from? What happened? What's the background? So there just is a lack of official data, or at least acknowledged data, or reliable data. We have a lot of interest groups involved here, as you can imagine. But there's also clear indications, and you guys know, who has this right? All of the New Territories people, male and female? No, you've got to be a male. Now, females can inherit, but females cannot make a claim for ground land. Okay, now this has all kinds of interesting implications. One of which is, well, how do the women think about this? How do the daughters think about this? What about the people who only had daughters, and then their daughters had sons, but they're not equal to other people's sons? Okay. So there's a whole lot of elements in this issue that just have never been studied before. So this is the first survey. Now, I think Yan and I, we've done so many surveys, okay? We assumed this was going to be fairly easy, okay? It wasn't. Now, it wasn't always just the difficulty of the survey. if you could envision like Russian dolls, okay, this is where these objectives come in, okay. The Russian dolls are, first the big one, okay, the big Russian doll is everybody in Hong Kong, okay. We had to disassemble that Russian doll, so we take the big doll out, we pull the next size out, and that's the general public, okay. But out of the general public, and the general public are people who don't have an interest in the small house policy. We had to open that group up and then pull out different groups. We found out there's the people, the men, who have the right to claim. And then we have family members who have somebody living with them who has the right to claim. And then we've got people who have family members with the right to claim, but they don't live here. Okay, they don't live with them. Okay? And then finally, there's a whole group, which I used to be one, who actually own a small house. I owned a small house for about 16 years, okay, in the Wong Clan village, okay, and of course, I can trace my ancestry to that, no, okay, so there's a whole bunch of people who now own these houses, okay. So we wanted to determine the proportion of persons who have an interest in the small house policy, so this is the small house interested persons, SHIPs, another nice Hong Kong term. Determine these various groups, and that's what we were just talking about. A are the people who have the right. B, family members living with them. Okay. C, those who are not living with them. And D, that's people who own the houses. Okay. We wanted to look at the initial knowledge, so we asked an opening question about how they felt about the policy, and then we got into all these various issues, and then we asked them at the end, again, a repeated question. All right. Part of this is telling us about how much do people know, and once they've thought about it, what do they think we should do? Okay? All right. So after these various issues, have they changed their minds? Now we also did a follow-up on this. We actually did a focus group where we brought people in from all of these different groups, had them meet separately first. It was really interesting. These guys can tell you, okay. And then Yan Yan was our main facilitator. We wanted to get somebody who was non-threatening, okay, and female, small, don't beat me up, okay, because there was a lot of emotion about this, as you can imagine. But we had a terrific focus group meeting where they actually worked out some ideas about how to solve some of these big problems, okay. And this shows you our breakdown. We took a heck of a lot of phone calls. One of the problems was we had to use the Caddy Lab at Baptist University, and you'll never guess what happened in the middle of all of our phone calling. Something called Occupy Central. Okay. And for some reason, the students got really diverted during this time period, so it was really tough to get all this phone calling done. It was already inherently tough. We made over 170,000 dialings. You guys in journalism make a lot of phone calls every day. Just figure out how long it would take you simply to dial your phone 170,000 times. Okay, just to dial the phone, much less to answer it, to determine who's on the other end. All right. So we had two groups. We had the first group of about 600, roughly 600 people, general public, and then we later kept dialing and matched that proportion. Now, we got a total of, as you can see, 606 people in the second group, okay, 627 people in the general survey. Now, I'll show you another slide in just a minute. This is a really complex report, so you've got to really think through this stuff, okay, because it's really 5 surveys in one. Okay, the first thing was surveying everybody, randomly finding out who falls into what group, until we finished the quota of the whole general public call. At that point, we could figure out, comparatively, what are the proportions of these A, B, C, D inside the general public, and what's the proportion of the general public compared to A, B, C, D added together. If you've got a question, ask me. Okay. this gets really interesting. And then we kept calling, but the quota was not a quota for A, a quota for B, a quota for C. It was just a quota for all ships. Do you own a house? Do you have somebody in your family? Are you a person who has the right? Okay. So the full survey gives us the rough proportions within the ship groups. And the two surveys together, when we were doing this part, gives us an idea about the rough proportions in terms of the total population. Okay? So while we were doing the full random calling, okay, we were picking up randomly A's, B's, C's, and D's. And we did it at one point, because of the caddy program, we can take the database out at the point we hit the quota number, 600 number of people identified. Okay, and the second point is when we hit the quota number for 600 completed cases. Okay, so those are the 2 points, and at these 2 points we got these rough percentage numbers of what these groups make up of the whole population. So people who have the right and have exercised it or signed up to exercise it, okay, people who have the right, somewhere between 2 and 2.7%, thereabouts, that's the rough number. Those people who have somebody living in their family with them, around 1%. People who have someone who has the right but not living with them, living overseas, okay, somewhere between 1.9 and 3. And then the people who live in the houses, and this is interesting, this number is really close to the number of small houses there is, both traditional and modern. Okay, very close. And by the time you take the people where they live and add it all in, our numbers came up pretty close to the actual figure that we know exist, okay? Because we've got to count on the houses. That's one thing we do know. All right? So what we found was ship groups A, B, C, and D together make up around 10% of the population. Okay? Roughly. All right. So you can see how we work this out. 2,437,000 households according to the census. Households. We run these estimated ranges. How many in your family are males who planned, estimated number of claimants, etc. We took out about a third because we figured, well, these people have to be related. Some of these people have to be double reporting, okay, because they're reporting a brother, or they're reporting an uncle, or they're reporting a father or a grandfather, okay, so it's got double counting. So we've actually just lopped off a third. Our rough estimate, and believe me, this is a rough estimate, but it's a rough estimate. This is the first time in Hong Kong we have such an estimate. We do know that Carrie Lam answered a question in 2011 where she said the government currently has, and this is the funny number she gave us, 10,000 registered claimants. Now I don't know if 10,000 is Chinese for a significant number. It's curiously round, okay. 10,000 sounds funny. You know, she didn't say 9,584 registered claimants. She didn't say 10,278 registered claimants. She said 10,000. Okay, now you guys in journalism know if you've had 10,000 casualties in Nepal, that means lots of dead people, right? So 10,000, I think, is just her estimate. Okay. Not counting the 10,000, yes, counting the 10,000, of which approximately 10,000 have already registered. So you can subtract roughly 10,000 from these numbers, so you get 75 to 80,000 more out there, right? Am I doing my numbers right here? Yep, 75 to 80,000. Yes?
To 90.
90,000. Well, no, you take 10 off.
Oh, sorry. Oh,
75 to 80.
Yep.
More in theory. Possible. Okay, and this is, I think, a pretty conservative estimate. This is the best we can get. All right. If you look at how much land that takes, multiply each of those possible claimants by 700 square feet, plus you have to have footpaths, driveways sometimes, various kinds of access space. You know, they put windows in, they don't build them right next to each other, okay? You get a rough estimate of how much additional land would be required. Now, this puts it in context. This is a cool graph, okay? The big green block is the total area of Hong Kong. The gray block is the current built-up area, now, of which this dark maroon, dark maroon, whatever, this is currently the space that's already being used for villages. And you can see the estimate, and the light blocks are the difference between the floor space and the surrounding space. Okay, so this is the current registrants, and this is the potential that our survey showed is out there. Okay, and that means that has to come from somewhere. More than likely this green area. Okay, now there's one other significant thing about this. It's in the footnote, but this is a big footnote. The small house policy land is a grant. It's not sold. It provides no taxes per se, in the sense that, you remember, most of Hong Kong government's revenue comes from land sales, okay, taxes on land sales. Well, the initial land sale, this is not one. This is a grant. Anybody here major in accounting? Do I have anybody? I'm trying to figure out what journalist major in. So I'm a journalist. Any accounting? Okay. If how much is it worth? Any idea? Don't know. Probably lots of money though, right? If I were to offer you a block, a big red block, for $1 billion, would you take it? You'd buy that for, yeah, I think you would too. That would make you the new Li Ka-shing for sure. Okay, that's a lot of money. That's a lot of money. And we're talking about a space that's probably, what, 2/3 of that? These two blocks added? Okay, maybe 60% of it? That's a lot more money. This is the impact we're talking about. Now, if this policy was supposed to house indigenous people, one of the questions you have is, well, how many indigenous people are actually living in the houses that are meant for them? Right? Now, we know all the people in Ship D are living in the houses. This is what's known as a tautology, because Ship D is people who own the house. Okay, but you'll notice also, Ship D are people who are not related. Okay, now, if you back up, Ship D is pretty good sized. A, B, C, D. Wow. Okay. And look at Ship C. How many of the people who have a relative living not in Hong Kong actually live in these houses? This is a tiny proportion, and yet this is the next largest size group. Okay? Ship A and Ship B are the two smallest groups. And yes, a fairly significant proportion of them are in small houses. But remember, these are small groups. Many of them are not. Okay? This becomes the interesting group here, because this is the largest group of claimants and potential claimants. And we ask the general public, have you ever wanted to live in a small house? This is a really interesting question that will pop up at the end of this. Okay. And 1 out of 5 people tell us, yeah, they want to live in a small house. They would love to live in a small house. This is a really interesting kind of wild card out there. Okay. Anybody else live in a small house? Oh, okay. You guys. So now we start looking at the various issues that we raise. Now, in these issues, you'll notice we've got the general public. This is people without an interest. Then this is ship group A, B, C, D. And then this is all of the ship people together, okay, proportionate to their totals. You get them all together, right? So in other words, you can compare the different responses of these folks within each other, see what their total is, and look at the public. And later we had for everybody. I'll show you for everybody. Okay? Right, so you'll notice there's some interesting variances that show up here. We have interesting differences among these groups. I mean, here there's almost no difference between ship C group, okay, and this notion about unequal enforcement against illegal structures. Definitely a big difference here with people who actually have the right. Now, that doesn't mean they live in the houses. Okay, this is the people who live in the houses. Isn't that weird? These are the people who actually live in the houses. These are the people, many of whom just sold it to them. Okay? So the first thing this tells us is, looking at these responses, is we know now that the small house policy interested persons are not a monolithic group. Not at all. So when you hear an official of the Cook say, all New Territories people, X, okay, we know immediately that that's not true. We know that there is no such thing as all New Territories people, X. Okay? There's various people living in New Territories, small house policy affected residences with different views. Not the same at all. Okay, villagers profiting by selling small house rights. Notice this, okay, of people who say it's important. The general public. People with the right but not living with them. People living in the houses. Okay? And overall, if the guy from here says all small house interested persons, this is of no concern to them. The actuality is, well, it's almost of equal concern if you put all of the small house interested persons together. Okay, everybody with me so far? How important is this? Okay, now again, look at the huge disparity. Discriminates against non-indigenous Hong Kong people. These are the rights holders. And they say, well, it's not very important. Okay? Everybody with me? One more. This is an interesting one, too. It's roughly 2/3 versus 1/3, saying it's important damage to the environment. Okay? But when you look overall, a majority of even the small house interested persons actually are concerned about damage to the environment. Okay? So not everybody supports the village elders getting out there with bulldozers and bulldozing down the mangrove. Okay? In fact, a majority don't. And this is where we see the ship's concern equaling or is greater than the general public's on these issues. But not hugely so. You would expect this about it being guaranteed by the basic law. But you still have a majority who are concerned about this. Okay. And this one is even, I think, really interesting. There's almost no statistical variance on this concern about unlimited claims and limited land. And this is really interesting because this provides an area where we can actually begin to forge some agreement about what to do about this. Okay? All right, so this gives you the table. Agreeing and strongly agreeing, the various measures. The ship A are the people who hold the rights, have either exercised them or are exercising them currently. They're on the register. Okay? And then the general public who doesn't have that. And notice this. We have a majority who agree that there should be a moratorium on the resale to non-indigenous people. If the policy is meant to house indigenous villagers, the houses should house indigenous villagers. Majority agree, both the public and the rights holders. Now these are the Ship A people. Okay? And you'll notice there's some interesting agreement about high rises on village land, various other issues here. And you'll notice that neither the general public nor the right holders want this thing to be abolished immediately. Now it's 44% there, but that's still not a majority. It's certainly not holding here. But something needs to be done. So there is agreement on taking steps. Right? And this is where we begin to break that down. And here you can see in these attitudinal questions by groups, and this is where you get this new column. Right? These are the same columns we had before. The general public with no interest, A, B, C, and D groups. All of the A, B, C, and D groups averaged together. And then this is, once you take these groups and the general public and put them back together into one big survey, if we were doing a survey of everybody, that is the proportion that we get. Now notice, for example, all of Ship A, with their strong agreement, okay, about no change, makes almost no difference in the outcome of the overall population. You know what I mean? In other words, an overwhelming majority of people overall want change. Same thing in the general public. Not among Ship A, Ship B people. But you put them back into the public, and it's a tiny proportion. It's a tiny proportion. Okay, this is the first time we've ever seen this. All right, no one's ever done anything like this before. Civic Exchange was truly pioneering this, right? And this then raises the question: if this is public sentiment, and these groups are this small and this isolated, why hasn't the government done something? Okay, we're going to answer that question. Okay, there's your comparison of the two groups. This is really important stuff. Okay. Another question about an expiry date, setting an expiry date. Agree. Now notice there's a lot of people in the general public who agree with this. There's a lot of people in Ship C and D, the two largest groups. Okay? And when you put all these groups together, this is what you get. That's a majority. And back in the whole overall public, it's an overwhelming majority. We say set an expiry date. Maybe not 10 years from now, maybe not 20 years from now, but certainly 30 years from now, or 25 years from now, or something, some sort of date. It can be negotiated. Okay. All right. This asks about priorities for new territories development. And again, we're comparing the ships with the general public. And this is all the ships with the general public. Okay? And you can see there's significant differences, and there's also significant differences by age. Those of you who are under age 30 are much more supportive of green space, okay, and conserving the country parks. And you can see this in the generational differences here. Notice this. Conservation, that's the purple. A majority of people under age 30 want it conserved. It drops to a third, about a fifth. Okay. So if you see an old guy, older than me of course, an old guy up here talking about we should build houses on all this land, why do we have so much park? Okay. He's not supported by younger people, okay, of the public and other places, within the ships also. Okay. results of the first question we asked. This is what we call the unconsidered response to the overall question. Okay, how much do you support or oppose continuing the small house policy as it is, implemented now, without changing nothing? Okay, and you can see that ship A, overwhelming support, it's fine, well, maybe need some changes, but most people supporting it. Everybody together, okay, that's a pretty big chunk. It says don't change anything, or, I don't know. And look at the general public, okay, that's not a big overwhelming majority at the beginning of the survey. Can people change their mind in 18 minutes? Yes. Yes, they can. In other words, I just told you how the government can change people's minds in 18 minutes. Most people are pretty reasonable. Once they find out about what the issues are, they're not going to go out in the street and start throwing rocks at each other. Okay, this is something that's solvable, unlike constitutional reform, perhaps. Okay, this we can do something about. Okay, and once you talk to people, people start saying, well, yeah, we need to change it. Obviously, something's not right here, and we can't continue it unchanged. It's going to run into all kinds of problems. We have to do something. Okay? We have to do something. Now, that's where we have the focus groups coming in. Okay? This compares it. Unconsidered. Okay. Oppose. Okay, you need to change the colors on this.
Oh, no, it's the same way around. It's just the wording is flipped,
The wording is flipped.
right?
Continue it unchanged.
And then the other one was...
Okay, all right, right. Supported unchanged. I got you.
Yeah.
All right. And this is
Want to change.
want to change. Yes. It's still a color change. You need to work on
It
these
probably
colors.
just needs to be flipped upside
You
down.
won't believe how much time we spent on the graphics, and obviously we need to work on this one. Okay. But the fact is that this, right, this shrinks to
The blue bit, yeah.
the blue bit. Okay, yeah, so
Yeah,
we got
blue
we got the colors
right.
right. Blue and blue, yes. Right. So we go from 18% to 8%. So we've changed the minds of 700,000 people, right? 10% roughly, in 18 minutes. That's better than Robert Shaw. Okay. All right, now, why is the government not doing anything? We think we have an idea. How many people have heard of consultations? People hate that term. I agree. We asked people about whether they participated in consultations on new territories planning. Here's what we found. Of all the meetings that were held, and what we counted was person meetings. In other words, persons times the number of meetings they say they attended. Okay, you remember how big Ship A is? It's not that big. In fact, it's really small. But this is the number of person occasions that they participated in, and out of combining these two together, was that 110? Out of 110 person occasions, 10% of the population formed almost 2/3 of the person respondents in attendance. So no surprise, the government probably found out that there wasn't much support for changing the small house policy in their consultations. Okay, everybody with me here? Talk about an echo chamber. Okay, and what's even more shocking, out of this 110 occasions, 2 rights holders, 2, count for 30 of these times. 2 people went to meetings and talked 30 times out of 110 times. And you say, echo chamber. This is a real echo chamber. This puts the Grand Canyon to shame. All right, so, question following that last question, when should the government review the small house policy? And you find that there is a ton of people in all the groups now, after having thought about it and realized we've got some really, number one, issues that need to be addressed, and number two, actually there's some solutions we can do. You have a very strong proportion of all the different groups supporting the idea of acting immediately or before 2017. Okay, in fact, you have 50% of even the rights holders ship A group themselves. Okay, so immediately or very soon. All right, so what are our recommendations after the focus groups and all this stuff? Okay, we found that there's really broad support for reforming the small house policy. But there is entrenched opposition from a tiny minority, and now we know how tiny it is. It's really, really tiny. Okay, but the government thinks it's much bigger than it is. Okay, because that's all they ever hear are the voices of the opposed. Okay, so there's majority support, very strong majority support, for immediately starting a review of the small house policy. We find that actually once you get people in a room and they actually start talking to each other, not a consultation, but an actual facilitated discussion, conversation, you can develop a lot of common ground and agreement. Okay? For example, a moratorium on resale of the small houses to non-indigenous persons. People who already own it, keep it. But otherwise, when it goes up for resale, it should be sold to indigenous village holders. Now that would solve a lot of the problem already. Second thing, and this was supported by a lot of the small house policy people, interested persons, including some of the rights holders in our focus group. They argue that the people who live in UK, who only come back here for 3 years or so, basically to get a big pot of money and then go back to UK, I mean, they're not really Hong Kong persons. Okay? Now, yes, I'm retiring and leaving Hong Kong, but I'm going to live very close to Vancouver, so it's kind of Hong Kong B. Okay, it's Hong Kong with clean air. And another thing they agree with is about stop expanding the village zones. And we know that there's a lot of discussion in the government about that. There's not as much discussion. What people want is, if you're going to fix the boundaries, fix the boundaries. Okay. Draw them out, nail them down, don't change them. Then you know how much you've got that is available. The funny thing we found out is that 1 out of 5 people who say they want to live in a small house, mostly it seems to be when we ask them about why were you looking for a small house, what interested you about it, they talked about environmental conditions, the air being cleaner, more space for their kids, more room, the cost of housing is cheaper. The funny thing is we found out that the size of the families of people living in small houses is actually slightly larger than the average size in Hong Kong, which means that if the government wants more kids, maybe they should improve the size of our housing. Hello? If you've got a little empty space, you might want to fill it up with a little one. Okay, but if you don't have any empty space, well, and produce a comprehensive development plan for your territories. I think that's it. Yes, that's it. All right, leave those up.
So anybody, any questions, please raise your hands and then just identify yourself, and then both Michael and I, or my colleagues there,
Yeah,
Karine and Mandy, who have been also working on these reports, will be able to answer your questions.
And Mandy did a lot of the really groundbreaking research to find out just what we don't know, and really helped us, craft this survey so that we could fill in those holes. So Mandy is really an expert in what's out there. Okay.
Anybody, any questions?
Would it be fair to say that I had a look at one of the earlier charts. So would it be fair to say that this report can also refute some suggestions among the general public that most people in Hong Kong want to
not a
saying
majority.
that most people actually just want it to be reviewed rather than,
Yeah.
than
Well,
actually abolished.
There are a number of abusive parts that people think can be fixed. And there are a lot of unclear parts, like for example, the boundaries of the villages that can be fixed. So there's a lot of stuff that can be fixed that people agree on. But there isn't an overwhelming majority of people who just simply want to say, stop it today, stop it right now. No more grants.
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
During the focus groups, it came out to some of the reasons why the general public didn't want to abolish the policy immediately without compensation. And one of the reasons that one of the groups said was that they were afraid that if you just abolished it immediately, there would be a lot of conflict provoked between the villagers and the government, and they were afraid of that. So that might be feeding into one reason why they're reluctant to sort of just say no more, and immediately.
I think most people want to be fair. I mean, I know that's missing in a lot of discussions, the fairness issue. But if you look on TED Talks, a very famous researcher named Franz de Waal, D-E space W-A-A-L, he's done research on both humans and animals, and argues that the fundamental basis of people's sense of whether something is right or wrong, or good or bad, one of the pillars, he says, there's two main pillars. One is fairness, and the second is this sense of empathy, of understanding. So I think our survey shows that among the general public, whenever we bring them together in the focus groups, there's a lot of sense of fairness and understanding, and we can work this out. Okay, and if the government would show a bit of empathy with people who are crowded into bad places, in small houses, and small apartments, and want to have children and so forth, want cleaner air, showed a little more understanding of that, and a little more courage, I think, also in terms of bringing people together. I think we can solve a lot of these problems without violence, without a lot of conflict.
And also, there are also a lot of rural power brokers and interest groups involved, like the Hungy Cook. So how does that also play into preventing the government from actually spurring change?
This is where I think it's really interesting. It's very difficult for an interested group to push its interest roughly on top of, against everybody else, once it is revealed how small it is. Okay, this is the interesting thing about this survey. It shows that the actual proportion of people who don't want any change, okay, because they have these deep interests, is not even supported by a majority of their own relatives and people who own the houses. Okay, that's the interesting thing about this survey result. It really strips that away. As I was saying, you can't be a Hungy Cook leader and say, well, we represent 10% of the population of Hong Kong, and we're all going to go out in the street and throw rocks and burn things down. That's not true. Okay, it's just not true. Most people, both in the public and in the interested groups, that's why we call them interested. We know they have an interest. Okay, we're talking money. People get emotional about money. Okay. We think that they can actually get together and negotiate and solve this. Now you may have a few diehards in the triads who, have cousins in UK and they want free money. But Hong Kong has stood up against corruption for a long time. We know we have problems with corruption in this society. This is certainly a source of corruption, and a lot of the villagers know it and they're not happy with it. And that's exactly what our focus group also told us. Some of the people who are the most concerned about the indigenous villages and preserving that tradition were the most adamant about what they regarded as people who were no longer Hong Kongers, had no interest in Hong Kong, cared for nothing but money. They didn't care about Hong Kong. And I would argue that anybody who says, don't touch this policy or else we're going to do violence, is not really interested in Hong Kong. They don't have Hong Kong's best interest at heart. solve these problems instead of just how can I make more money.
Which government department actually keeps data on this stuff?
Lands department?
Okay, so if I wanted to say I want to exercise my right, I want to apply, I would go through.
Actually, the applications process by the lands departments. Yeah, when the applications is submitted, then they have to go through administration's process.
And how long is that process?
Oh, gosh.
Oh,
Years.
normally,
Years.
yeah, the government promised,
And longer
previously
sometimes.
promised in 2006 to 7, which is about within 1 year. However, it's not the case.
It's not the case.
Yeah. Normally, some villages complain that it takes longer than 10 years.
Yeah. The village I lived in had that case.
Yeah.
There
Just to
was-
add to this, and then in our previous report, 2013, page 10, we've got a flow chart telling people how to do the claim procedure, and then how long it takes. This one.
There's been a tremendous amount of work on this by Civic Exchange. Thank God. There's more data in those 3 books than you can find. You can spend the next 6 months talking to the government, trying to pry it out of them. There's more data in those 3 reports by far.
Just mention from Harvard, you have mentioned that there is the in the consultation process, authorship could dominate the consultation process. So any suggestion towards any further? Maybe the government will have a consultation soon. So any ways to do a more fair consultation?
I think everybody knows, and the Bahia Foundation wrote a very interesting, long report about the flaws in the consultation process. Okay. And a friend of mine at the airport authority has talked to him, and also some folks I've talked with at MTR say that it's much better to talk about engagement and stakeholder engagement. In other words, you get the people who are interested. In a way, it's not you don't just open the door and say whoever wants to come in, come in. You basically try to get people to come in who are representative of various groups, proportionately too. I mean, that's what our focus group did too. So and then you facilitate a discussion of these things. Okay. If you're trying to figure out what can we do that's going to make most people satisfied, that's the way to do it. If you simply don't want to do anything, then you do it the way the government's been doing it. Okay. But then that leads to all kinds of problems. It certainly doesn't lead to solutions. Okay. So the whole consultation process, I think we should throw that word out. It's a 1970s word. Okay. Nobody uses a 1970s telephone. Okay. You know, the mobile phones then were like this. You had to hold them with both hands. They were huge. And nobody uses that technology anymore. You know, it's time for the government to modernize. Let's get rid of this whole notion of consultation and develop an engagement, facilitation, conversation, representative discussion, dialogue. We need to work out different methods of doing this. Okay. I think the MTR and the Airport Authority both are really interesting in how they're changing the way that they do these things because they've run into problems just like the government has. And they've got some really interesting, innovative ideas. And I think also the focus group practices we do here. There are better ways out there. You know, I think even the UN has a recommendation about how to do engagement on policy changes. So for heaven's sake, it'd be really nice for Hong Kong to enter the 21st century, you know, in terms of our technology of working with the population on policy changes. You know, we don't need 40 more new think tanks. I know everybody's starting a new think tank. What we need is people to actually think instead of keeping it in the tank. Okay? Let's get it out. We know what to do. But we don't need more reports. We need to start doing what we already know.
Well, in addition to the nature of the processes, but perhaps I think in Michael's presentation or in our findings, we know how much 18 minutes can change people's mind. I think it's also important to put out a lot of related information so that the general public will get more interested in this So when there is stakeholders engagement or dialogue or conversation, the general public will also be interested in getting involved in those sessions. I think that's another way
Yeah,
of
yeah,
doing things.
yeah. I mean, a lot of people don't think they are interested. They complain about housing prices. They complain about small houses. They complain about the green areas being paved over. They complain about all the stuff that is one of the some of the implications of the small house policy not being addressed. But if you ask them about the small house policy, they're not interested. I mean, they don't know what it is. I mean, this is one of the problems, you know, we getting the information out there. Now again, I mean, most of the time people turn around and blame the media. This is not the media's business, okay? Should be, if it's a government priority, this is something that we should be getting, APIs, announcements of public interest. You know, we get APIs about cleaning your kitchen, doing all kinds of weird things, but the really substantive stuff, I mean, the substantive stuff that really makes a difference in the quality of people's lives, come on, let's do a better job of that.
It's the survey show a big diversity between the young people and the old people. They
Yeah.
look for the conversation, the conservations versus the building more houses. But the people said that, and in the survey said that they want to buy the small houses just maybe for the good, better air quality and better environments, but they still want to make a great development to build more houses. How to solve this kind of
Yeah, well, I think that's what